Hi everyone, and thanks for being with us for this first session on this, I have to say, beautiful stage. Even if we don't have roots like on the other one, it's really beautiful, and I hope the content will be as interesting. This first session is about a really hard but also really interesting challenge, and probably underrated, which is decarbonizing the shipping industry. And we have experts here. I know it's really tried to say, but that's really true. We'll go a bit more into their background, and all of them have a lot of experience and also have their finger on the pulse of innovation. I think it's one of the things we're going to mention, but behind innovation, of course, we need investment and we need collaboration. So those are two key topics we'll also discuss. And in terms of innovation, of course, we need startups. There are some that are already considerably helping with this, but there are more needed, and also depending on the time horizon. So it's another thing we're going to discuss. But without going too long in the introduction, I'd like to introduce each of the panelists. So going one by one, Stylianos, you actually have 2 decades of experience in this. So can you tell us a bit about your background and why you're interested in this panel?
Yes, I'm a marine engineer. I work with Lomar. It's a shipping company, and we have created a venture lab that's part of the industry. I'm a shipping guy, and the last 3 years I've turned into innovation to solve the biggest problems we have, for which there's just not enough solutions out there, so we need to create them.
Great. And Duncan, before this panel, we were just talking about, I think I read somewhere that you made 200 investment, and you told me that's outdated.
Yeah, that was about a year ago, so it's now 300. No, just kidding. Yeah, I think I've done about 300 investments in total. I'm definitely not a maritime expert compared to my co-panelists. We're deep tech investors. I specifically focus on hardware and chemistry. And the maritime sector was just a very, very interesting area for us. That's why I've started to invest in the space, now done 10 investments in that area.
Great. And Hélène, can you maybe tell also a bit what GTT is, and then the CVC arm you work with?
Yes, of course. So GTT is a French company, initially coming from designing LNG storage technologies. Those technologies are really important to transport energy from natural gas from the US and Middle East to Europe or Asia. And we have therefore a very strong connection to the maritime industry. And we are a company of engineers, but we also would like to contribute to transforming that industry. And this is why we have set up our corporate venture fund. So coming from the engineering world, but entering into the dark side of financing and investing.
Great. So Duncan, you said you're not necessarily the maritime guy, but you're going to be the numbers guy. So can you give us some numbers on why we need to reduce emissions?
I mean, there's a number of reasons. The biggest one, obviously, is climate change. So the shipping industry, if you include some of the internal shipping as well, contributes about 3% of global emissions from a greenhouse gas equivalent perspective. And that's a challenge. That doesn't sound like a lot to some people, but then you think about aviation is only 2%, you're 50% more than that. And it's growing. One of the main reasons it's growing as a portion of overall greenhouse gases is that other sectors have been more forward-thinking than the maritime industry has until recently about what they're going to do. And you can look at projections where it's projected to go potentially up to 18% by 2050 without some correction. There's a bunch of other reasons as well. I mean, there's pollutants that come out of the maritime industry. It's ecologically not particularly good. Ships generally tend to be anchored near ports, and they create a whole load of pollution that's bad for humans. Nitrogen oxides, sulfur dioxide. Those have actually started to come down, but interesting, one thing I found out recently is sulfur dioxide has been reduced from the shipping industry, but that's actually having a warming effect as well. Sulfur dioxide, bad for health, but actually has a kind of at about 0.5 centigrade cooling effect overall on the planet. And so in reducing that, we're also kind of increasing this urgent situation with the amount of carbon emissions coming from the sector.
And one thing we learned from other sectors is, of course, it's hard to make things move without regulation. So, Hélène, can you maybe give an overview of what's been happening with the International Maritime Organization?
Yes, of course. So shipping is an international business. So we look to the IMO to set the stage and the pace of reducing emissions and providing the right framework for that. So there's nothing that's going to hit you hard if you do not respect the trends and the objectives that have been set. However, a few tools are coming together. So there's first the CII, that's a carbon intensity index for a given ship, and that basically rates an asset, whether it is not really emissive or quite a lot. And if you have a bad rating, a little bit like your appliance system, then over time you might not be able to operate that ship if you do not make some corrections. So this is meant to provide an incentive to use technologies or other means and reduce those emissions profile. Europe has done some things as well, including shipping emissions into the EU ETS. And this is actually coming in line this year. So ships that are calling into European ports will have to pay taxes, depending on their routes, etc., etc. And it's quite, it has an impact. So it can amount to 10,000, 15,000 euro per day for the larger ships and the most emitting ships. So it's starting to, the regulation is starting to help.
That's great. And Stylianos, I think one thing you wanted to emphasize was that anything has to be global, right? Because it's a global industry.
Yeah, correct. I mean, we are serving the global economy. This is the shipping service. That's what we do, and ships trade from one country to the other. So global rules must apply. There's no point regulating locally and then expecting everyone to comply with this, because people will just circumvent countries that have odd regulation, or they will only go there if there's no way avoiding it. California is a good example. They've gone way ahead with environmental regulations. They have been for years, to the point that people just exclude trading in California when agreeing a charter party for fixing a ship. And if the charter wants to send their ship to California, then you charge a premium because you have to comply with all their funny requirements. So in a way, the industry likes to move uniformly, and so consensus is super important, which is the role of the IMO, the International Maritime Organization, to make rules that are common.
And does this apply to the EU, or is it too big to avoid?
It does apply to the EU. The EU has gone a bit rogue with the Fuel EU and the EU ETS. Rogue in the sense that it didn't wait for the IMO to adopt things. So it created a sort of two-speed environment. And we're seeing this elsewhere as well. In a way, this is part of a sort of political or diplomatic play to push the IMO to adopt stricter regulations. So Europe is taking the lead by adopting these regulations and hoping that the IMO will come in its way. But we hope to see eventually, maybe even in the next year, a sort of meeting of the two where the EU will come to align with whatever the IMO decides to do.
Right, and the IMO has actually done some pretty outrageous aggressive targets. So recently, about a year and a half ago, they decided, hey, by 2030, we want to reduce the carbon emissions from the shipping industry by 40%, which is insane. No other industry, I think, has done that. The challenge is, at the moment, they haven't really decided what happens if you don't do it.
Right.
They're just sort of saying, yeah, you're going to try and reduce it by 40%. So there are some really amazing forward-thinking shippers, and particularly Maersk, NYK, and a couple of others, that are just saying, we're just going to do this anyway, regardless of knowing whether we're going to get regulated against or not.
I'm glad you mentioned that, because one thing I want to be mindful of is I don't want to paint the image of an industry that's super conservative, because I think that's not the case in some other ways, especially in terms of technology. So, Hélène, can you maybe give a sense? I don't know how many people here have seen a big ship or a cargo ship recently, but I mean, it's a huge machine. It's technology at core, right?
Yes, actually, ships are great pieces of technology. They need to be to sustain themselves in very harsh environment. Huge. They see a lot of constraints. They can transport basically anything, and they need to be super reliable. So it's one of the engineers' wet dream to design a ship. Basically, you have rockets, you have planes, and you have ships. So it's a tech-savvy industry, and you can have great conversations about applying new technology on ships.
Mm-hmm. Stylianos, you have a lot of experience in that industry as well. Is that what drives people? I mean, I'm sure there are great engineers, and some of them could become founders as well.
Yeah, it's definitely an industry where tech is part of the business. We own assets that are technological assets. There's not anything on a ship that's not engineered. And through the years, people have made successful businesses by adopting more and more innovation. So, there's been a transition historically going from sailing ships to steamships, from steamships to diesel ships. So these are just like energy transitions, but they also represent a change in technology. And there's a deep-rooted understanding in mostly families that run shipping companies that, you have to be forward-thinking and innovative, but there's a risk to being too quick, too early.
Right.
So it's about getting the right pace. And I think in this respect, it's regulations, but also just technological maturity is a key part of when things will get adopted. But historically, we've always innovated. When I started working in shipping, I was still with people that have sailed on ships with 60 crew, so 60 persons manning a ship. Today we have barely 17, and that's because of automation, adoption of new technologies, and by the way, the ships have gotten like 10 times larger in the same period. So we're definitely there to adopt innovation.
And just to correct myself quickly, because I also mentioned about engineers turned founders, but Duncan, for instance, you work with a lot of PhDs, also turned entrepreneurs, and they're supportive you're from that profile, right?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, like a lot of, if you're a chemistry PhD, for example, and you're looking at the future of fuels, the shipping industry is a very interesting first step. And we're there to support companies that are looking to those areas, and we help with the heavy engineering, which makes it maybe less daunting than what it otherwise seemed.
Great. So I just wanted to remind everyone that you can ask questions with the app that's me mentioned. So there's just a QR code that you need to scan, and we'll get to the questions at the end. So that's just a reminder. But Stylianos, you mentioned time frame. So I just wanted to go into a breakdown of the type of solutions that can help, because I think it's helpful to think, okay, what can be done now versus what can be done later. And Hélène, if you can give us an overview, that would be super helpful.
Yes, sure. It's a bit of a simplification, of course, but we see basically 3 steps. First is trying to work with the fleet and the asset that you have and try to reduce emissions from that. So there's many things you can do. I cannot go over everything, but it includes digitization, and other technologies that you can use on existing ships. The second step is trying to think about a different ship. How can I change the design of my ship? What kind of new technologies can I include in that ship to, by design, make it less emissive and more efficient? And the third step, and that things will not be perfectly in a sequence, but it's trying to implement things that will handle the rest of the emissions that you could not reduce with the other 2 steps. And this could include carbon capture, low carbon fuels, maybe autonomous ships and things like that. So it will build over time.
And just to be clear, Duncan, because usually when we talk about what can be done now, people think of digital solutions, but you're also seeing like hardware being applied right now, right?
That's right, yeah. So I got into this maritime decarbonization world because we did an investment in a company called Neptune Robotics. They're now having the biggest impact in our portfolio for maritime. I think there's a whole load to come. But they take robots, they go into ports, out also anchorage, and then they clean the biomass off. So the barnacles, seaweed that accumulates whenever you stop, particularly in warm waters, but pretty much anywhere. Those will accumulate. They account up to 18% of the drag. Therefore, 18% of the fuel is lost from just having an accumulation of this on a ship. They remove that, and that, if you think about that 40% target, that outrageous 40% target, you can get almost halfway there just by making sure that ships are clean. Then you've got things like air lubrication, so bubbles that effectively go around the side of the ship. We haven't done an investment in that area. There's some cool companies there. That can then, you can get a few percentage points there. There's augmentation to ships. You've seen sails, you've seen like these kind of large cylindrical sails as well. These are all areas that can just chip away before you've gone to like the infrastructural issues that you're talking about with fuel. And we have LNG starting to come online. That's tricky because you've got to think about the overall life cycle of the carbon emissions of getting that LNG to the port, and then how much of that is slippage and methane, which actually creates a worse problem. But anyway, you've got those things starting to come in. You've got also dual fuel ships, so they can take a combination of methanol and existing heavy fuel oil, which can make a big difference.
Hélène, what else have you seen in terms of things that can be commercialized now?
Well, I think Duncan has mentioned a lot of things. We see great companies in air lubrication as well. We've invested into a wind-assisted propulsion shipping company. It's called Bound for Blue. They designed one of those relatively large cylindrical suction sails, actually. And that's actually also a great illustration of what is required from a company to be successful in that industry. Still early days, but have good traction. And what they've worked on is making an actually good business case for the ship owner. So it needs to make economical sense. It needs to have decent payback, and it needs also to be ready to be industrial. So we expect them to see more of them over the years.
Yeah, I think Stylianos, that resonates with you. Right earlier, you said, "Okay, don't go too fast," or maybe that's not exactly the warning. But what would you tell founders?
Yeah, I think basing your development is essential. But I think for deep tech, it's actually quite a good match because deep tech takes time anyway. As you develop the deep tech solutions, you just need to keep an eye on what the industry is adopting. Price points are super important in this because, and I'll just build on what's been said earlier. The industry is, the nature of shipping is incredibly efficient because of physics. Like moving cargo through water just takes less energy than flying it or moving it by road, which is why we carry over 90% of goods that are traded. So yes, the 3% is a big number, but it's a small number compared to how much the shipping industry is moving, whereas aviation moves very little by comparison, but produces almost as much emissions. So, and that's, by the way, an argument a lot of people in the shipping industry are using for not doing anything, which I'm not supporting, to be clear. But because it's so efficient, it takes a little bit of energy to move things. And with new tools that are now available, we're seeing a lot of advances in sort of physics-driven AI that can really help further optimization. So I think we'll see a lot of stuff. But the industry provides a service that's also important to the world, and it's extremely price sensitive. We move stuff by a ton per mile, and every cent that you add to this disincentivizes people from exporting or importing goods. So to your question, I think founders need to be there to offer technological solutions that are not crazy expensive, because people, much as we need them, will not be there to pay high dollars for solutions. So it's a balance between what you get and how much it costs, or cost benefit. Yeah.
And on the other hand, there are things that will be developed for other reasons and that will have sustainability as a byproduct as well, right?
True. I think autonomy is a good example where the point of autonomy is perhaps to go from 17 people on board to even fewer, 0 maybe one day. But a byproduct is that ships will be more efficient in the way they're managed, because you take humans out of the loop, so the decisions can be more rational in terms of direction of the vessel, power consumption, like the whole way the ship is managed. Yeah.
And then can you talk about fuel earlier? How realistic do you think? I mean, what's the time frame for actually using renewable fuel? Or
well, it's already happening. I mean, the first methanol electric-powered ships, and even like the first ammonia ship has been trialed and tested. The challenge with a lot of that is not burning the fuel in the ship or keeping the fuel in the ship, it's bunkering the fuel at the places that ship is going to go. So, you know, it's all well and good having a ship that can use ammonia, but like, what happens if there's no ammonia at the place that it needs to go to? If it's not on a fixed route, you suddenly got to think about this as a much more systemic port problem than it is just the ship. And that's one of the constraints of the industry, but also one of the opportunities. So one area we're really excited about investing in is just multi-fuel ships, multi-fuel technologies. So being able to add, you know, you've got your HFO, which you're always going to have. You're always going to need to burn that. But then you can add in methanol at the moment, and then you can have a reformer to add ammonia in as well. You can potentially do co-firing of those. So you may have just a smaller amount of ammonia on the ship, but then you can burn it more efficient, burn the overall fuel more efficiently to be able to overall lower the carbon emissions of that crossing. And like I said earlier, is you know, very much about making sure that the process to get that fuel to the port is green in itself. You know, there's no point in using coal to then make a gaseous or a liquid fuel, which then is low carbon, but the overall life cycle has been very detrimental. So these are areas that we see are very interesting. They're kind of like the silver bullets that you need to have multiple fuels being burnt in one ship.
And you once again mentioned that it's a global challenge. We're going to repeat that a few times. But Hélène, can you go a bit more into the role that the IMO can play in terms of, we said earlier there are no penalties now, but what's the pace of the change that might happen under their impulsion?
Yeah, and beyond the IMO, how can states and public bodies contribute, and maybe how can we cooperate? It's really setting the right framework for cooperation and collaboration, and making sure that trying new technologies is not creating too much of a risk for those who own the ships, basically. And so it's reducing that barrier of taking the risk of a first of a kind on the ship. No, not everyone is as innovative and at the forefront as Lomar Labs. You need sometimes a bit of time to convince the ship owner to install something new on their ship, because the last thing they want to experience is a disruption in their operations. So it needs quite some time to explain. And at the same time, investments can be a little bit significant. So we've seen good grants that are directed to first applications on ships that are really helpful.
Great. And Stylianos, you mentioned it's an industry that likes to move together. I think that's the term you use. So what does that mean, and how many players are there? Give us a sense of how that works.
I think that's more in terms of technology adoption. So if you think of the typical technology adoption curve, there is a bunch of companies out there that are very innovative. I like to think we are as well. And we're in that first 15%, but then there's a chasm, and then you cross it and there's the majority. But that majority is quite compressed in the shipping industry, so it's not so much of a bell, it's a bit of a peak. And so when the inflection point comes, which could be triggered by regulation, then everybody jumps on the wagon, and there's like a 3-year madness for the global fleet of 90,000 ships to adopt that one technology that's now hot. And so as a founder, if you're there to sell, you need to think how you're going to solve the problem of being there to benefit when the party starts. So how do you produce, how do you supply your customers, how you support them, but also avoid building excessive infrastructure too early to anticipate the party, which you won't be able to sustain for a long period. And we saw this, there was an adoption of a regulation called the ballast water treatment regulation 10 years ago, and it was voted, and a lot of companies went out and built technology to be able built capacity to be able to serve the industry, and then the industry dragged its feet for a bit, pushing back the adoption. And the result is some of these companies went out of business because they were ready and the race didn't start. And then so you have to be sensitive to this.
This though is the really important and really exciting point. This is what got me hooked as an investor, just looking at new opportunity areas, exactly what Stylianos just said. You've basically got like, it's not a cartel, but it's kind of like, it's a conglomerate of different big companies that are there that control the industry. And when they all kind of interact with the IMO. The moment that one moves, everyone has to move. And they've got different shipping lines. And so if one has a green shipping line, their competitors need to come in with a green shipping line as well. And so you're going to get this like Cambrian explosion of all of these technologies being integrated, very, very much like you did with the aviation industry, where you've got like a bunch of big purchasers. You've got the same dynamics there kind of waiting to happen. That's the hope anyway, waiting to happen with the maritime industry. There is a drive towards it, and there is going to be a bit of a mind shift, I think, needed within the maritime industry. It is a cost-driven commodity industry. They are going to have to realize that costs are going to go up as we're regulating in some of these more initially expensive fuels, but that's okay because they make margin on cost, and it's just going to have to be, as long as it's pushed throughout the industry equitably, then it just means that the margins will produce the revenue they require. So this is why I think as investors and also as founders, the maritime decarbonization area is one that is very, very exciting as an opportunity area and totally overlooked.
Mm-hmm. Hélène, one of the things we talked about was also that we need multiple stakeholders involved. So maybe give an overview. I mean, of course, there are regulators and our investors. Who else?
Yes, and it starts with the client, but then who is the client in that industry? We have talked about ship owners a lot, but it's actually quite a relatively complex industry where you need to think about shipyards who build ships. So you need to take them into account in how they play a role in implementing a new technology. Do you need their buy-in to handle installations, for instance? If yes, that's conversations and things you need to work on. So ship owners, that's obvious, but also charterers. So those are people who are renting ships to displace goods from point A to point B. And in some situations, they are paying the cost of fuel, for instance. And they might ultimately be either benefiting from the improvement of a new technology or not care at all. And if they benefit, how can you convince the ship owner to invest in something that where's there, if you do not change anything, nothing in it for him? So it's a little bit of a complex industry where you need to understand, founders need to understand who is playing a role in the particular application you're targeting. And then also public bodies, flags, and countries who can, again, help with reducing the financial risk of implementing something new.
Mm-hmm. And do you have any advice for founders to educate themselves on that?
Well, first attend panels like this, and maybe try to reach out to the most innovative players in that industry, talk to ship owners, talk to corporate ventures that might be also helpful in that space.
Great. So, Duncan, you mentioned a few times that there are definitely similarities with aviation, but I think one of the differences is probably the flow of investment, right?
Thus far, yeah. So if you look back over the past 10 years, about 50% of the transportation venture dollars went into automobiles. About 35%, I think, went into aviation, and that ramped up massively over the last couple of years, where it was like 50-50, maybe even 60% over a couple of years around the COVID period. In that time, about 10% of the dollars have gone into shipping, and then there's some in rail and other areas. About 10% into shipping. And that is, to me, really good for early-stage founders and early-stage investors. If you believe the narrative that we're going to get this kind of explosion of interest, because I talk to a lot of these big shippers, they are desperate to get their hands on anything that can help them get to those IMO goals, the 40% goal. If you believe that, then you'll see, hey, this is actually one of those areas that's suddenly going to get discovered by some of the bigger growth stage investors. Some are already doing it, but you'll have a kind of a diversification outside of strategics into just financials, and that will be an area where you'll get a catalyst for creating the fastest route to market for some of these technologies. That's the bit that I find really exciting, but it's good that there's 10% there because it means there's a lot to grow in terms of percentage of overall VC dollars.
It's interesting also because usually when investors found a niche, they don't want anyone else to get in, but basically you're encouraging founders and other investors.
Well, we've done 10 investments now, so yeah, come on in. If it was 2 years ago, I would have been like, no. Just kidding.
Yeah, and Hélène, another thing you said is also that shipping is a bit of a barometer, right, for other industries in terms of what can be done, especially in transportation.
Yeah, so it's a kind of barometer for global trade, and this is another very interesting point. It's like not only do you need to think about some of the regulations and some of the technologies that are going to be adopted for that, for decarbonizing. My personal view, as I do a lot in kind of reindustrialization work and kind of industrial resilience, is that actually global trade is changing dramatically at the moment. Countries are looking at energy independence, countries are looking at reshoring manufacturing, and the idea of us shipping 90% of global goods across intercontinental passages versus local passages changes. I'm not saying that we're going to move away from shipping. We'll probably stay with shipping, but we're probably going to go towards, I say probably because I don't know, probably going to go towards a place where we do much more regional shipping. So within one country or within one region. And that to me starts to become very exciting when you start to think about archetypes of ships, as you were mentioning earlier. Like I see, if you think about more expensive fuels, become much more expensive when they're on smaller ships. The whole reason we've got these gigantic ships is because it lowers the overall cost of shipping per ton. When we start to do smaller journeys with more expensive fuels, suddenly you need to start looking at things like kites, like wind power, like all of these different areas where you can have kind of a much more efficient, smaller ship, that's a smaller archetype that's able to carry a much lower TEU and then can still be reasonably profitable, certainly more efficient to go through water than it would be to go on a road. And so that's an area that I think is going to be very interesting.
I'm actually going to dive into questions because we have a lot, so it's great, and some are specifically directed at some of you. So Hélène, someone has a question for you on how GTT is using energy storage to decarbonize the industry.
Thank you for the question. Well, LNG, as it was mentioned before, is already available in a certain number of ports. And it's a fuel that is really less emissive than using the basic HFO or diesel options for ships. You can reduce roughly 25% your emissions because it's simply a cleaner fuel and the combustion is cleaner as well. So a first step is implementing gas-fired engines and LNG storage on any kind of ship, not only LNG carriers that are the larger number of ships that are using that. That I think is a very first step.
Mm-hmm. And Stylianos, I think you're the best fit for this one because maybe you'll object to that also. Do you see growing demand from shipping companies calling for alternative fuels and startups trying to build this?
I don't see growing demand for alternative fuels. I expect growing demand for alternative fuels in the future, but for the time being, there's the issue of cost. They're still expensive compared to the alternative, which is bunker fuel, and also there's limited availability. The thing with shipping being global, that if you make a choice on a certain fuel, you have to be able to find that fuel wherever you trade, and the infrastructure is still coming up. So yeah, hence the cleanest fuel is the fuel you don't use. We go for efficiency, reduce our consumption, and so when eventually we can have and will want to buy alternative fuels, we'll need less of them.
Mm-hmm. And staying on that topic, because we have a slightly more technical question on that, in terms of what do you believe is the future of fuels for shipping? Is it methanol? Is it fuel cells? Is it others?
Well, that's the $10 billion question, isn't it? I don't know. I think there's a lot of... Sorry, was this addressed to me? Yeah.
No, it wasn't. I just tricked you.
It's not batteries.
Okay.
Or maybe it is.
So Duncan, this one is addressed to you, and I think that's your area. So what's your opinion on the hottest investment area in shipping?
It's difficult for me to not have present bias, but like I would go with the silver bullet one, which is the mixed fuels right now. That's the one that seems to be most interesting, because then you can remove yourself from the infrastructural challenges and just concentrate on propulsion within the ships and not worry about ports and some of the challenges they would bring. I love wind. I think we've been using that for centuries. If you can find ways to harness wind, that's a great one. It's immediately obvious. We know that. There's going to be a whole load of interesting stuff happening within defense and how we look at defense and shipping. But that's a whole different kettle of fish, which we're going to talk about now.
Still from that same person, and this one can be for anyone. What single technology do you think having true game changer potential? So, if I may, one of the things we want to say in this panel is that there is no silver bullet, but still, if someone wants to highlight a specific technology that could be interesting.
Micro SMRs.
What's that?
Modular reactors. So if you could have very small nuclear-powered ships, that would be fantastic. That would solve everything.
Great. What else?
Yeah, there's a few people working on that, but I think anything that can help towards automating and distributing the infrastructure, that would be super valuable. Think swarms of cargo ships with no people on board, requiring no energy or no fuel.
Things that don't take up much space. I think that's one of the challenges. That's why carbon capture is such a problem with shipping. I do believe we will get there, but it's a nightmare because a ship is all about maximizing the amount of cargo space. So if you've got to store a load of carbon and the machinery for doing that, then you've got issues.
Yeah, we'll need help from someone to jargonize. So, Hélène, maybe, do you see CDR as a valid option to contribute to decarbonization of the shipping industry? So first, tell us what it is.
Carbon dioxide removal, I guess.
Right.
Yes. Right. So we have not dived into this because we prefer to see practical solutions to practical problems. And CDR is its relative infancy. And so imagining getting a carbon credit marketplace compensating for other steps that you can take in the industry is something that we have not looked at yet. But some others might have.
NYK is doing that right now. Yeah, so they're buying carbon credits.
Yeah, so we have some experience with that. We've one of the startups we support called Benu is breaking down methane from the atmosphere. So it's not carbon, but it actually counts more than carbon. It depends how you do it. We've looked at stuff that uses the ocean to create plankton or other substances to remove CO2. Once you get into the geoengineering domain, it becomes tricky ethically. Should we start fiddling with the balance of the ecosystem? But removing just the stuff that we've put there, like in the case of removing methane by simply replicating what nature does in the stratosphere, doesn't seem to pose a threat. It's just, and it's a good way of offsetting a ship's emissions by, in the same time, doing some good as you move.
Yeah, I actually have a related question also on carbon capture and how realistic is it to do. I think the question is on cargo, on ship.
That's really hard. Yeah, we've looked at it quite a bit, and there are companies doing it, but again, you've just got this problem of how to deal with it, and is it better just to go with a CDR approach, where you just do like carbon capture from the... That's the only time I ever say this. I'm a point source carbon capture person. I hate this idea of like doing a DAC versus going to the problem. It's like pumping up a tire before you've mended the punctures. It doesn't make sense to me. But in this case, I can kind of see the justification for it. You get a certain amount there with fuels, mixed fuels, and then you say, okay, the rest of it, I'm just gonna have to do DAC or CDR.
Mm-hmm. And at the same time, that's why it makes it a very interesting tech problem, to try and solve that constraints of low footprint and making sure it's really efficient and not taking too much space in also to store the CO2. but you still have a 4% concentration of CO2 in the exhaust gas, so that what comes out of the engine. And that's still a lot higher than in the ambient atmosphere. And so we have been looking for, and hopefully we will find something that is actually performing much more efficiently than DAC and CDR schemes. So.
Well, we've been experimenting as well with carbon capture. I do see this being part of the solution. So, we remove by efficiency much of the fuel we need. We remove some of the CO2 by using cleaner fuels, but there's still going to be a balance of some carbon atoms emitted, and you have to capture these. But I think it's a great space for innovation on the business model side. Yes, captured carbon has a weight, and the medium in which you capture it adds further to this, which is negative for the ship transporting stuff. But a lot of the ways in which carbon can be captured generate something of value. So you can create, fertilizers, for instance, that when you arrive at the port, you can actually sell and make a new revenue stream. So there's ways to think about this that solve the problem and also create value and are not just a cost center.
Mm-hmm. Well, talking about cost, actually, someone wanted to understand better what you said about being crazy expensive. What would be an affordable enough price of carbon abatement per ton of CO2?
Well, we've looked at what current solutions cost to remove 1 ton of emissions per year. And we're looking at something around $300 of CapEx investment for removing, it's a one-off payment. Yeah, so for the life of the ship, one time you pay about $300, and then 1 ton of CO2 is forever removed from the emissions of that ship. That's a sort of reasonable number that the industry is willing to pay. So any solution that comes kind of within that range or below it is easy to adopt. Anything that's higher than that, they've got a target towards the works. Or it's just a matter of time when things will get more expensive and then people will run out also of cheap solutions.
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah.
And Duncan, you mentioned defense in passing, and that's also a topic I'm interested in. So something related. Someone asked, how important is it to have local supply chain given the current geopolitical environment?
That's a meta question. We're going to get really political if I'm not careful. I think we're entering a period of time where that is going to be the direction that we need to focus on. It's a lot of the work that we kind of do is like new technologies that enable local resources through either reuse, recycling, or through being able to process for the first time in areas so that you can have a complete supply chain within your borders. We now see a global political situation where that's just necessary, sadly. And so I think that's a critical part of what any large industrial company needs to be thinking about. And that is a great opportunity for startups because there's a whole lot of opportunities there.
Yeah, I think that's really one of the things we want people to take away from this panel, which is there's a lot to do for startups, actually. I don't want people to think that the fact that there's no silver bullet is bad news, because it's actually good news. It means there's a lot to do. There's a lot of collaboration needed. There's a lot of innovation needed. More investors, as you said, Duncan. And I'm really thankful for the questions because they were really varied and showed really, is this the solution? Is this the solution? And the answer is no, but it's actually a good thing because it all adds up. So thanks everyone for listening. Thank you for the questions, and you can find the speakers afterwards outside, so please ask them directly questions if we didn't cover. Thank you very much.